We're here to we're here to talk about your film, The Creeping. So thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule at the moment. I guess we should we should start with the fact that The Creeping has got quite a nice position in Fright Fest, in the fact that it's one of the scary films that's actually on at the scary time. Are you excited to scare people just before they go to bed?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a weird one, isn't it? Because obviously I've been going to Fright Fest for many, many years. And I know that when it gets to the late films, sometimes people are a bit like, oh, screw this, I'm too tired, I'm going to go home and sleep until the next day. But a lot of the really memorable films I've seen at Fright Fest have been in the like really late night slots. So yeah, hopefully people do turn up and they enjoy it and get a spooky, creepy time before they go to sleep.
And it's Friday, it's a Friday night film, so it's still early enough in the festival that people aren't, they've not burned themselves out at the Phoenix or the Imperial too much. So I think you've got a good shot at a good turnout.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, I hope that's true.
And you spent the best part of the last decade sort of making short films. What was it about the story for The Creeping that made you decide that this was the one that you wanted to sort of expand out to feature?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like most filmmakers who've made a lot of shorts, they obviously want to progress to making a feature. Honestly, it's just about money and opportunity. I had tried to make several features over the years and just never been able to get them off the ground, really. And the reason I managed to get the Creeping off the ground is because I had access to this really amazing location. And if it wasn't for that, the Creeping wouldn't really exist. So we based the entire story and the script and everything around that really specific house location.
I mean, that must help in the writing process when you can sort of visualize that area. Because I guess sometimes when you're writing a script, you don't necessarily know where you're going to film, and then you maybe have to retrofit it when you do see the location. So I guess this was a big benefit of the piece.
It definitely was a benefit because the story was born out of the location, really, and I reverse engineered the script in a way to fit the location. So not to spoil anything, but The Creeping has scenes that take place in an orchard and an outdoor swimming pool. And in the background, you can see a big Gothic, like 1,000-year-old church. Now, if I was just writing the script on spec, uh, I never would write those scenes because how the hell would you find that location? You'd be like, this just doesn't exist. I mean, but it does exist, but you'd never find it, right? So yeah, when we had access to the location, I literally reverse engineered the script to fit the exact location. So I didn't write anything into the script that I knew we wouldn't be able to film, essentially. So it was quite helpful in a way. Yeah, you're right.
And the film, so your background in shorts comes into play quite early on, like the whole sort of almost prologue of the film feels very much like it could have been one of your shorts. Was that an intentional move to sort of like have this short scare at the beginning before moving on to the bulk of the story?
I guess so. I mean, uh, I like films that have those sort of like cold opens where you don't really know, they just sort of chuck you into the story. I guess I'm not a very intentional script writer. I just sort of write what I think I want to see. I don't try and intellectualize it too much. Um, but yeah, it is a bit like a little self-contained story, isn't it? I mean, I guess the opening, a lot of short films, that would be the film, right? And then it would end and it would sort of be like a teaser to a wider story. Whereas we just happened to make the rest of the story. But yeah, it was a fun making that short little intro for sure, because it was like a mini little one day shoot essentially.
And the story sees Anna move in with her elderly grandmother Lucy, who is now starting to suffer with dementia. And there's been a couple of films over the last few years within the horror genre that have explored this illness. What do you think it is about this condition that makes it so interesting for storytellers?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I think it was probably like the taking of Deborah Logan, right, that really sort of like kicked off that whole like elderly, well, especially elderly lady with dementia. And I love that film. It's great. I think I'm not sure why there's been a few over the years. I mean, personally, I was a freelance filmmaker for the last decade, and I, for some reason, ended up doing a lot of work for sort of like charities and the NHS, and weirdly, a lot of work around sort of death, dying, and bereavement, as like that whole sector is called, and about people having a good death and that sort of stuff. And with that came the territory of obviously like elderly people and Alzheimer's and dementia. So I ended up doing a lot of work, making a lot of films and editing a lot of films around that subject. So when it came to writing The Creeping, at the time when when I was writing The Creeping, there weren't that many horror films that had explored that, because I actually began writing The Creeping in 2017. That's how long it takes to make a low budget indie film. So at the time I was like, oh yeah, I'm being really unique, not knowing everyone else was doing the same thing. So I think what makes it interesting is you can explore. I mean, dementia and Alzheimer's is a horrific disease because the person you love is still there, but like they're not there as well. And that it's not sort of like necessarily a visual thing where it eats away at the body or anything like that. It's just their mind just begins to disintegrate. And that thought in itself, where you just won't remember your loved ones, you won't even remember their names, that is horrifying. So I do think it lends itself quite well to sort of like genre stories and to explore that sort of horrifying disease. Yeah.
I think as much as there are some other films like Relic and things that deal with it, I do think that The Creeping approaches it in a different way. This is much more about like ghosts from the past. To get is all obviously linked in with people that suffer with this condition because they're so out of time. So I think although it's under that umbrella, it's a very different and unique story in its own right.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I tried to explore, I guess, the dementia in a way of like, does Lucy, the grandmother, actually have dementia, or has she been so tormented for the last few decades by what happens in the story that she sort of lost her mind? And I wanted to try and keep it a bit ambiguous, but yeah, I did try and approach it in a slightly different way to other films, I hope.
And like I say, it's sort of dealing with like ghosts from the past and thing, and it's a very almost like classic ghost story in a lot of respects, which obviously means a lot of scare sequences. You really sort of play with the viewer's expectations. There's a couple, we won't spoil them here, but there's a couple that come in just the most mundane of circumstances and from the most typical of origins that they really impact. How much fun did you sort of have constructing all of these different scare sequences?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun writing them and directing them and editing them. Obviously it is a ghost film, spoiler alert. But that doesn't mean all of the scares necessarily need to happen at night. I guess it's that sort of midsummer thing about creating a sense of unease and foreboding even at all times, even during the day. And just because it's daytime doesn't mean scary things can't happen. So that was one thing I tried to do. And another thing I like to do, because it's a ghost film, instead of trying to shy away from those aspects that people call cliches, I mean, I just call them like tropes of the genre, right? So I just wanted to lean into them. So, the whole like the bedsheet ghost, which is obviously can be a bit cheesy and not scary, right? A bedsheet. But my intention was to actually try and make it really scary, and lean into it and not try and make it like a jokey, silly thing. Actually lean into the sort of like cliche tropes and just try and actually make them scary. So it was quite a lot of fun coming up with the sort of the scares, and I tried to stay away too much from like actual jump scares. I like it when films have more of a build up and then there's a scare, rather than just, you know, a cat jumping out of nowhere or something. Those can be a bit cheesy, so I tried to stay away from those.
Yeah, and that definitely comes across in the film. It's a lot more about things appearing and disappearing from the frame, and sort of the strangeness of the image that sort of causes the discomfort, rather than, like you say, just suddenly some really loud noise and, you know, a door slamming or something. So it definitely comes across in the way that I think you're intending it to.
Well, thank you very much. That's good to hear.
I mean, were there any sort of visual styles or tones that you sort of look to for the appearance and sound of the film?
So I mean, the creeping is set in the 80s, the main bulk of the story, 1985, but it has flashbacks to the 60s and the 50s. So my intention really was to try and make it look as much like an actual film from the 80s as possible. So that was really my overriding sort of stylistic choice, I guess, is make it look like ghost films from the 80s. You know, like one of my favorite films of all time is The Changeling, which is just a fantastic film. And the cinematography and the sound design and the music, it's all just so of its time, but also sort of like timeless as well. So I like it when films are of their period, but also have a sense of like timelessness. That's why, I mean, it's set in the 80s, but I didn't want to do stuff like the sort of strangest thing, sort of synthy music sort of stuff. That just wouldn't have fit the creeping at all. Yeah, so I guess the time period is really what affected my overall sort of stylistic choices in terms of cinematography and sound design and music and that sort of stuff.
And we're talking about the film in the run up to its Fright Fest screening. You know, you've mentioned before that, you know, you've been to a lot of, you know, Fright Fest in the past. So you obviously, you know, there's obviously something about, you know, this genre that intrigues you and excites you. You know, if you had to sort of pick an aspect of the genre, what would be your favorite?
An aspect of the horror genre.
Well, you know, yeah, what is it? Because obviously, like, Fright Fest is the dark heart of cinema. You know,
Yeah.
what genre sort of excites you?
I mean, horror really is what excites me as a genre for sure. I mean, and I love all aspects of horror and all the subcategories, you know, sci-fi horror, ghost films, slashers, zombies, you know, you name it, I love it. I do tend to lean more towards the sort of spooky horror films that try and create an atmosphere and a sense of foreboding, rather than the sort of like slasher OTT gory films. Now, don't get me wrong, I love them. Evil Dead is one of my favorite films. Even the remake of Evil Dead is amazing. But I tend to lean more towards the films that have a sort of sense of like melancholy about them, bittersweet, sort of like The Orphanage is one of my favorite films. And it's such a sad movie, but it's like so beautiful as well. And those are the films for me that like really linger in my mind afterwards. Yeah, I guess that's just what appeals to me really, is exploring that sort of like the horror of sort of like family and trauma and that sort of stuff. Yeah, I guess horror is the best genre for that, really.
Yeah, definitely. And why should the Fright Fest family seek out your film?
They should seek out The Creeping because it's a low budget indie horror made in the UK. There aren't an amazing amount of them around because they're pretty hard to make and get financed and funded. And so, yeah, I guess, you know, it's having its UK premiere at Fright FrightFest, the largest UK genre festival, and it's a low budget UK film. So come out and support it if you want to see a creepy, spooky movie with bedsheet ghosts.
And you've sort of spent like the best part of 5 years working on this. Have you had a chance to decide, what you might like to make next?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always writing scripts like most filmmakers. I've got a whole bunch. I wrote like 3 feature film scripts during the pandemic, all at varying sort of like budget levels. The last one I wrote was another ghost story, but it was set in 1890 Victorian London. So, the budget of that would would be insane. So I'm not really expecting that one to be made anytime soon, at least. I have a script that I would love to make next. It's sort of a cross between Possession meets sort of Black Swan with some sort of like Cronenberg body horror thrown in. So it's not a ghosty, spooky movie. I call it a psychosexual body horror. It has like, weird things happening with tentacled monsters, and yeah, I would love to make that one next, but I guess we'll have to see if anyone's willing to take another risk on a weird script.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with your future projects, and have a great time at FrightFest.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you so much.